Ah, communication. That magical word that's supposed to fix everything, right? And yet somehow it's the very thing that makes us want to tear our hair out, especially when we're arguing about something. It could be minimal, like who left the wet towel on the floor again. And then if we add recovery from addiction into the mix, suddenly that wet towel, it's going to represent everything wrong in the universe. Good times, huh? If you're in recovery, you already know that communication, it's vital. And if you're the loved one of someone in recovery, you know how important communication is for your healing. Not just, you know, for you, but also for your loved one, the one that's struggling with addiction. And when it comes to relationships, especially those romantic ones, talking about feelings and our needs can feel like trying to perform brain surgery while you're wearing oven mitts. Not that I've ever tried to perform brain surgery, but I would imagine that's what it feels like. So let's state the obvious, right? Recovery changes everything, not just for the person struggling, but for the loved ones too. Suddenly, the ways that both of you used to cope with like stress, it those things they might be off the table, and you're left with this thing called talking it out. Yikes. And I don't know about you guys, but the deeper my husband got into his addiction, the worse our communication got. So instead of turning towards each other, we turned away. And of course, we know where that led him, right? To chat rooms and lunch dates. Yeah, yes, she says with only a hint of sarcasm. And of course, today, things are so much better for us. And I know people think it's weird because I will say now, we're over a decade past all that. I'm grateful for what happened. Yes, I went through a lot of pain and all that, but had that not happened, I wouldn't have had that opportunity to dig deep into myself. And then we wouldn't have had that opportunity to work on ourselves as a couple. Now, did I want to go through all that pain and all that hurt? Of course not. But that's my silver lining in all of it. And so today we'll talk about healthy ways to communicate, including using the Heal check in conversation tool that I created. Hi, I'm Laura, and welcome to Bookends of Recovery. And this is the podcast where recovery and healing, hope, and of course, most importantly, you take center stage. And I'm very grateful that you're here. So, most common roadblocks that couples face when one of their partners is in recovery, it's of course going to be trust issues. Maybe trust has been broken during active addiction. Obviously for me, we had an issue with, well, not we, he had an issue with pornography that led him to go into those chat rooms and go on lunch dates and just, emailing and stuff like that. And so the loved one might be wary while the person in recovery may struggle with feelings of guilt. There may be shame, and this can create a big communication barrier where one person is constantly on the defensive and the other one is always feeling suspicious. And I will warn you of making sure that if you are the loved one, there has to come a point where you choose uh, to begin to trust again. And for the person that is in recovery, you have to show that by your actions because words alone will not do it. The loved one has to look at what you're doing rather than what you're saying. So if this sounds like you, you're definitely not alone. Like I said, we were right there. And I'll never forget my husband asking me, why would I stay with someone I couldn't trust? And it's a valid question. And I told him that just because I didn't trust him in that moment, that didn't mean I'd never trust him again. And, like I said, we're here over a decade later. And while I can't get to 100% because the trauma I went through was so damaging, I'm at 98%, which is much better than 0%. I was able to do that because my husband was open and honest and transparent, and most of all, remorseful for everything. And he was also willing to do whatever it took to recover and learn how to communicate because neither one of us had healthy role models growing up. We never learned how to talk to people in a healthy way when things weren't going well. I had a great role model in the fact that my dad set me up for success, like with family talks and stuff. Like I knew that if something was going on, I could come to him, but there were certain topics that were just off the table. And so for me, I wanted to take that with my kids and then kind of take that a step further and be like, okay, you have a safe space here with me, but we can only do what we're taught and then try to do better. And so I can't do what I don't know. And so I resorted to what I had been taught, which was just shut down. Or, my mom was very passive aggressive. And so that's how I was with my husband. He had been taught, to be seen and not heard. So he just shut down. And then eventually both of us just put walls up. And so after trying to, me trying to do it alone and, heal of trying to do it alone and being on a very unhealthy form that I've mentioned that I did before, I was able to find a healthy support system, which I recommend, whether you're the person struggling or the partner. Please find a healthy support system. So, do you find yourself struggling with guilt or shame or trust? Do you have a sobriety circle or a healing hive? And if not, ask yourself, what is one thing that you can do today to create one? And I know I pose these questions a lot, but it's because I want you to get out there and, and do the things that I didn't do for myself. And if you're finding that you're like, I don't need it, why? Why do you feel like you don't need it? And I'm not saying it has to be one thing or another. It doesn't have to be 12 steps. It doesn't have to be smart recovery. It can be an online platform if that's where you're more comfortable. Or it can be an online meeting. Like whatever you think works for you. Just make sure that you're not staying inside your own brain. Surround yourself with people who have been where you are. And expect it to be your journey to have emotional roller coasters because recovery is a wild ride. One day the person in recovery might feel like they are on top of the world, and the next they're questioning their self worth. And then, meanwhile, the loved one might be feeling hopeful one moment and absolutely exhausted the next. Navigating these highs and lows without, you know, taking them out on each other, it's not easy. And we had to learn how to cope with these extreme highs and lows without using the unhealthy communication skills that we had developed over the years. We had we had become skilled masons, building up those walls between each other. And if you can relate to that, it's common. It's so common. And thankfully, those bricks came down the more vulnerable we were with one another, because we started to learn that it's okay to share those naked truths, even those scary things. And as we did that, when we allowed ourselves to be vulnerable, we grew closer because we weren't afraid of being judged by one another. So if you're in that place, go ahead and share something vulnerable with your loved one, because that's what they're there for. And notice if you're being using like avoidance and defensiveness, right? Because if someone is used to numbing emotions, um, talking about them might feel just so foreign, right? It'd be like diving into shark infested waters because you just get so afraid. And then on the flip side of that, people might avoid certain conversations out of fear, right? Like, I know for me, I didn't want to talk about certain topics because I didn't want to trigger my husband's stress, or I was afraid that if I talked about something, then he might have an urge that might cause him to have a setback, which of course I'm not responsible for that. He has to learn, or he had to learn how to manage that on his own. And so we had to realize that, you know, avoiding tough topics, it only makes things worse. And we were guilty of that so bad, just avoiding and being defensive. And each of us shoved things down just as a way of just not dealing with it, because it was easier for us to take things out on each other by being passive aggressive or just using like a low blow on one another, because when you do that, it stops the conversation. And so if that's what you find you're doing, ask yourself why. Are you trying to avoid a topic because, you're doing it out of fear, or the topic itself is bringing out something deep down? Ask yourself, why are you avoiding that conversation? And I'll be honest, I'm really not sure how we got to a place of hurting one another, because neither of us were like that when we got married. We used to pride ourselves on sitting down, having these, like I said, family talks. Not only did I do it with the kids, but, he and I had the same thing. Um, but I think fear and hurt drove me, and shame and guilt drove him. And it was just the easiest way to shut down any conversation we didn't want to have in that moment. You know, you say something that's going to hurt someone, and bam, that conversation's over. It's like that saying, hurt people hurt people. I'm grateful that that phase, for lack of a better word, didn't last long, because I think if it did, not I think, I know I would have left. I would have left him, because, you know, it was all so new and we were hurting so much. And we just didn't have the coping skills to understand how to communicate our hurt and my trauma effectively. And like I said, this is where I stress to those going through betrayal trauma, and those of you in recovery going through what you have been numbing, please get support. You know, get counseling and don't go through it alone. So here's my exercise opportunity that I'm going to throw out real quick. What coping skill can you use to communicate with your loved one? And I'm going to apologize because I feel like you can probably hear my fish tank in the back. The water level's a little low, so the water, you know, from the filter's probably hitting it pretty hard. So if you can hear that, I apologize. Um, but yeah, so moving on. Sometimes, like, loved ones expect that once recovery begins, everything's just going to go back to quote unquote normal. Yeah, so recovery creates like this new normal, and adjusting to that takes time and patience and a whole lot of grace. And that was me. Um, when my husband really started digging into his recovery with his CSAT and group and meetings, I thought, oh my gosh, like everything's going to be perfect now. When in fact, the opposite happened, because, I mean, shit got real for him. He was peeling back layers of the onion. And that's what I had been doing in my own recovery and healing. And those first few months, I was having emotional setbacks, and he was having setbacks before things had, you know, settled down for him. And he found what coping skills worked for him. And I got to give a shout out to Condeo. It's not available anymore, but shout out also to Fortify, that kind of took what Condeo used, because that gave him the tools that he needed. Uh, you know, and one of the best things was he said to me was, you know, I'm sorry I hurt you. What can I do to make it better? And he meant it. And then he would sit and listen, like really listen. He wouldn't interrupt. He didn't get defensive, you know, even when the source of my anger was triggered by his addiction. And this helped me feel understood and less isolated and scared. Now, he did stand up for himself, and he should have, because he told me one time, you know, I understand your hurt, but I will not be berated. I need to pause this conversation until you're not so upset. And oh my gosh, I was pissed. But he was right, because the trauma would, because like I said, we didn't yell and scream at each other, and we didn't call each other names, but I could use words to cut deep. And he didn't deserve to be berated and to have me use his addiction against him. That wasn't fair. And so he still deserved respect and dignity. And there were moments that I didn't give that to him. And so I had to respect that he could, he had the right to, you know, put boundaries in place where he was like, okay, I need to pause this until you can kind of like chill out a bit. And so we were both learning to communicate effectively and respectfully. And this is something that happens over time as recovery and healing progress. So be sure to pack your patience because we didn't have, like I said, any kind of healthy boundaries for a few months after disclosure. And so that may be something that you might want to take a look at. What are your expectations and also what are your boundaries? And also remember that people have different kinds of communication styles and um, different ways to kind of process. Maybe the person in recovery tends to shut down and think, while their partner is more like, let's talk this to death. And so that can make conflict resolution almost feel impossible. So you need to find a way to bridge that gap because I'm someone who, when something happens, I want to talk about it right now. Like, let's get this taken care of. Let's just get the resolution done and over with. Where my husband needs time to process. He's a thinker. So, and it took me a long time to realize that even when we sit down, even now, like we'll sit down and talk about something, and I'll think, did he hear what I said? And then it'll be like 3 days later, and he's like, so I thought about what you told me, and I'm glad you said that because blah, 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 blah. I'm like, wow, he really does listen. But he really does, he needs time to think. Uh, and then, because I mean, before, when I was processing through the trauma and the addiction and, for him and all that, I was definitely, remember Veruca Salt from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? That was me. Like, I want it now. And so we had to learn how to process those emotions. And yeah, it's just one of those things you have to learn about each other. Something else to keep in mind is, of course, healthy communication is the cornerstone of any relationship. But when one, or in our case, both of you, is in recovery, it's not just important, it's a matter of survival. Because without it, resentment is going to build. Misunderstandings become these giant rocks of just, those building blocks of recovery. Well, these misunderstandings just become boulders, and before you know it, you're arguing about the way somebody breathes or chews their food or just sits there and watches TV. Like, it becomes ridiculous. And you want to avoid that. Like I said, it's the wet towel. When it's not the wet towel, it's about everything else. And it's not just about avoiding conflict, it's about learning to navigate it without destroying each other in the process. It's about creating a safe space where people feel heard and valued and respected, even when things get messy. So that's why my husband and I have rules when it comes to disagreements. There's absolutely no name calling. I broke it one day, and that was the day of my second disclosure. I called him one bad name, and even he says, it was justified, but we also don't yell. And and I think that's because we both came from relationships. Like, my mom screamed and he had a relationship where somebody screamed at him, and so that's just not our jam. And we agreed to the timeouts. If things get heated, one of us can hit the pause button and come back to it later or the next day. And we try not to let 24 hours pass if we can help it. But we always come back to it. And then we also promise not to get into circular arguments where you find that you're just saying the same thing in a different way. You're arguing the same point over and over away, or derailment, where it's like you start out arguing about one thing and then shift over to something else. So we try to stay on topic. And then, of course, bringing up um, the past, where it's like, okay, I'm arguing about this. Now I've derailed into this. But wait, I know I can win this argument if I bring up something from the past. So we don't do that either, because we used to do that a lot. So, how do you communicate effectively? Well, if there's trust involved, there are some strategies that can help. And one of the biggest things is leave the baggage at the door. You know, um, make sure that you can have well, I suggest, like I said, one of my best tools is having check-in conversations, because it's done. You can do it, uh, you know, 2, 3 times a week if you're in the beginning of this addiction process, or you can do it once a week, or just whenever you're like, hey, look, I need to do a check-in conversation. So I use the acronym HEAL, and H is for a couple of things. One is honesty, where each person shares openly and honestly about their recovery and their healing. And you can also use the acronym HALT in here, where you can share triggers, but be careful with this one, because this is only if the person wants to hear about them. Remember that the partner may not want to know about them, because hearing them can be very triggering. I made the mistake of wanting to know every little thing, and then knowing about what triggered my husband then became my own trigger. So you got to be really careful with that. And then H can also be for humbleness, because you want to make sure the tone of the conversation that you guys are having stays humble, calm, and remains a safe place to share freely. Because if your partner is sharing openly and honestly with you, you don't want it to become this place of judgment or shame or guilt or anything like that. You want this to be a safe space. E is for emotions. So do your best to avoid basic emotions like happy and mad and sad. The idea is to dig deeper here, because you're turning towards each other. You're sharing your deeper emotions like resentment, frustration, scared, those kinds of things. If you need help learning those deeper emotions, try using an emotions wheel. A is for apologies. If you've done something wrong, now is the time to apologize. And mean it. No excuses. Don't say, I'm sorry I did this, but, just, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. And then A is also for action steps, because you want to be able to not just share things that you plan on doing, like support groups or meetings or counselings, but things that you plan on doing for each other. Like if there's a way that you need to take an action step to help each other out. And then you also want to affirm your partner. I appreciate how much work you've done on your recovery this week, or I appreciate how much, you helped me by taking the garbage out. Just even the little things make a difference. And then L is for letting go. Like, what are some things that you've been hanging on to that you can work on letting go of, like those resentments? But also for listening, because you want to make sure that you practice active listening as you listen to each other. Make sure there's no distractions, which means cell phones need to be on silent or even better, not in the room with you. Make sure you're maintaining eye contact and practice empathy. And if you're new to healthy communication, it may help to repeat or rephrase what your partner's saying. So make sure you understand. That helps you make understand what you're saying or they're saying. So, for example, say something like, "You're saying you felt left out when that happened this way," and I know it sounds silly, but I'll tell you what, my husband and I tried this and found that when we repeated back what the other person said, we found that we did not understand what the other person said. It's not because we weren't listening, it's because we found that we were planning what we were going to say next, which was a bad habit that each of us had to break. So, I'm curious, does a check-in conversation seem like something you can benefit from? And if so, try a check-in conversation, because I would love to know if it's something that you could do. Uh, but one a suggestion before diving into a check-in conversation or any conversation, uh, do a quick emotional check-in. Just ask yourself, are you hungry, angry, lonely, or tired? Halt, anyone? Address those needs first, because you're more likely to snap or misinterpret each other's words. And also, some other helpful tips. There's a huge difference between "you never listen to me" and "I feel unheard" when we talk. So try to use I statements, because when you say "you," it sounds like an accusation. When you say "I feel unheard," that sounds more inviting, and someone's going to be more apt to kind of like listen when they hear that. So you can actually, if you want, practice rephrasing complaints into I statements. So just do like, "I feel," insert emotion, "when," insert situation, "because," and then "I need," and then state what you need. And just remember, active listening is about genuinely trying to understand your partner's perspective. Even if you don't agree, just there's no interrupting, no planning your rebuttal in your head, and no eye rolling. That's mostly for me, because I am so guilty of forming my answer in my head before my husband was finished, like I said. Uh, and then when I thought I had, conquered that and was so proud, my counselor was like, "You have something else to work on." I was like, "What's that?" Uh, I said, "I listen, I don't interrupt, I don't say anything." And my counselor was like, "You may not say anything, but your face screams." And she was so right. Like, my face did scream. So ask yourself if there's anything you need to work on. So, changing the way we communicate. I get it. It's not easy, but it is possible, and it's absolutely worth it. Remember to be gentle with yourself and your loved one. This is all about grace. And keep in mind, it's a marathon, not a sprint. This does take practice. There is a workbook on communicating in a healthy way on my website. And as always, if you have any questions about communication or anything else, feel free to reach out. I love hearing from you. You can message me on Facebook at Bookends Addiction of Recovery, or you can share your thoughts at my latest blog post, or email me, bookendsofrecovery.com. As always, this is Laura. I am sending positive vibes to all of you, my wonderful superstars. Thank you so much for being here.